Hello, and welcome to the Logistics of Military Protection with Antoine Bousquet. Am I saying that correctly, Antoine? I did not see that first. Bousquet? Okay. Um, just to give you a short description of this roundtable, or rather workshop, um, the description that we have on the Facebook event basically reads, littered with electronic sensors and crisscrossed by the watchful eyes of orbiting satellites and drone aircraft, the contemporary battle space is placed under intense and persistent surveillance. With precision-guided munitions that can be delivered to any position on the globe, any entity an advanced military can perceive and track is liable to being struck with devastating accuracy and lethality. This contemporary martial condition can be encapsulated by one prominent strategist's pithy formula, according to which, quote, visibility equals death, unquote. This talk will chart the historical constitution, present operation, and future ramifications of the disembodied gaze, surveying the planetary battle space, which, through its key functions of sensing, imaging, and mapping, constitutes a vital enabler of contemporary exercises in the targeting and projection of military power. In conjunction with the manifold countermeasures taken by belligerents to evade or deceive this roaming eye through dissimulation, misdirection, and bedazzlement, war has increasingly become a struggle for mastery over the fields of perception, with profound consequences for both the character of armed conflict and the place of human subjects within it. In particular, the talk will reflect, in the aftermath of the Paris and Brussels attack, on the constitutive role of lethal visibility in the shifting spatio-temporalities of war and the increasingly manifest inversion of the martial gaze onto the various societies that have assembled it. And just to say a little bit about Antoine, he's a senior lecturer in international relations at Birkbeck, University of London. He's the author of The Scientific Way of Warfare, Order and Chaos in the Battlefields of Modernity, which came out from Columbia University Press in 2009. And his research interests include the relationship of war and society, political violence, the history and philosophy of science and technology, complexity theory, and international political theory. He's been published in a range of different journals, including International Affairs, the Cambridge Review of International Affairs, Millennium, Journal of International Studies, Cold War History, and the Journal of International Relations and Development. And presently, his main research project is called The Martial Gaze, and this constitutes an investigation into the transformations of vision and perception in warfare, as manifested in the colonization of the electromagnetic spectrum, the development of cartography and geoinformatics, in the increasing role of camouflage and stealth technologies. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Antoine, and thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for the introduction. And for saying it. Is your levels okay? Giving you more feedback. Okay, that's better. Okay, so I'm going to try and thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to try and put the slides on. Is that okay? Hopefully everyone can see that. Jason? Oh,
yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
That's good.
Okay, so well, what I'd like to do is start first is by reading you a brief extract from an article published in the scientific journal Nature in 1870. And it concerns a so-called electric torpedo defense that was set up in preparation of the defense of Vienna by the Austrians during the Austro-French War of 1859. So this is what the journal Nature tells us. A camera obscura was erected in proximity to the harbour in such a manner that the horizontal table of the instrument reflected the whole area of the channel. Large wooden cases, each containing 400 pounds of gun cotton, were lowered at certain fixed distances into the water, and as these disappeared one by one, a small rowboat described at the time a circle around the spot to indicate the extreme confines of the distance at which the torpedo would prove effective. An observer was stationed in the camera as these operations were going on, carefully watching their reflection in the instrument, and as each torpedo disappeared into the water, he marked with a pencil its precise locality on the white table, tracing also the ring formed by the rowboat. Thus, a series of circles was formed in the camera each of which was marked with a distinctive number, and in this way a miniature but exceedingly correct plan of the obstructions in the harbour was prepared. The wires in connection with the torpedoes were afterwards led up into the camera obscura and furnished with numbers that correspond with the circles. By means of this arrangement, a sentinel stationed in the apparatus might at once explode any one of the torpedoes as soon as he observes the reflection of an enemy's ship pass within the limits of the circles marked upon the table. The channel itself was quite clear of any suspicious buoys and beacons, and appeared to the enemy wholly free from obstruction. And you've got here a couple of illustrations of how this system was supposed to work. It's not entirely clear that it ever functioned as intended, since it was never tested in battle. Certainly it would have been inoperative at night or under other conditions of limited visibility. Yet, in its ingenious but still relatively simple design, it encapsulates the programmatic ideal of an old martial dream: to see without being seen, to articulate perception, representation, and geospatialization within a single integrated process of remote targeting, ultimately to accord vision with annihilation. If we fast forward 150 years from then, we find ourselves in a world in which the battle space, now de facto rendered as the entire planet, is submitted to intense and persistent surveillance, and where any entity that can be perceived and tracked by an advanced military is liable to being struck with devastating accuracy and lethality. And so, in a sense, it's with this contemporary condition as a starting point that my research has been seeking to answer three main questions. The first, quite simply, to ask, how did we get to this point? How did we get to the point which Martin Libicki describes as that in which visibility equals death? What, in other words, is the socio-technical history of our present moment? The second question concerns the issue of the new forms or new phenomenologies that are being produced through this increasingly dense mediation of war, and via the socio-technical assemblages of perception that arise. How, in other words, are human bodies and minds being reconfigured and rearticulated as they are ever more tightly interwoven with their machines of war? And finally, what are the ultimate implications for conflict and security of such conditions of ubiquitous surveillance and targeting? What are the consequences of war increasingly hinging on the struggles within the perceptual domain? So I've tried to capture this with the notion of a martial gaze. This is indeed, as Jason has indicated, the title of my forthcoming book. And it's an inquiry into what Paul Virilio called the logistics of military perception. And Jason knows Virilio a lot better than I do, but of course he coined this phrase, and he wrote over 30 years ago a book entitled War and Cinema, which laid out that first notion, and I think is an important touchstone for my own research. But in many ways, I want to do some of the things that I think need done since Virilio wrote that book. I mean, for one, the book is 30 years old, so there's been some developments since. It also has quite a strong emphasis on cinema, which is not necessarily my concern here. But also, I wanted to really add some empirical analytical depth to the suggestive and occasionally hyperbolic claims of Virilio. And the term that I've homed in on is this idea of a martial gaze. And by this, I tried to understand the key operational, functional components of this ability to accord visibility with lethality. And I've distinguished between four elements. One that is sensing. That's to say, the ways in which military organizations acquire or sense or acquire information on their environment and on the entities within it. Imaging, the ways in which this sense information is represented, distributed, analyzed. Mapping, which corresponds to the georeferencing of sense perception and images, which becomes, of course, essential when we're thinking about the targeting of force. And then the function of hiding, which is not necessarily an immediate essential function of the gaze, because it works as a counter-conduct. It's, in other words, all the different ways in which adversaries try to foil and counter the Martial gaze. But of course, in its resistance, it then stimulates further developments in the Martial gaze. So what I want to do is to really walk you through these 4 elements. Throughout most of human history, of course, the human eye was unaided, but it was the main perceptual guide to warfare. But, of course, this begins to change in the early 17th century with the invention of the telescope, which is the first extension of visual reach. And from the very start, the inventors of the telescope recognized that it had military value, and it did indeed take on such a function. At the very presentation of the telescope in the Dutch court of Count Maurice, and this is in 1602, Ambroglio Spinola, who was the commander-in-chief of the Spanish army of the Netherlands, when he saw this telescope being presented, claimed that from now on I can no longer be safe, for you will see me from afar. And in many ways, these are quite prescient words. Because the invention of telescopy stands at the beginning of a dramatic process of deepening and extension of the perceptual field, far beyond the innate capabilities of the human organism. It, of course, reaches beyond the visible spectrum, beyond the senses that humans are normally equipped with, to go beyond the entire range of what we call today the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, I will discuss in a moment some of the military applications of telescopy and some of the other sense organs produced. But first, I think it's important to detail how perception is functionally integrated into the operation of targeting. And I want to suggest here 4 orders of targeting, according to the manner in which perception is entrained into socio-technical assemblages dedicated to the delivery of lethal force. So these 4 orders of targeting are the orders of aiming, ranging, tracking, and guiding. And they appear in succession, so they're historically successive, but they don't supplant each other, importantly. They become assimilated and integrated into each other, and each corresponds to a way in which perception is integrated into the process of targeting. Let's look first at aiming. It's the most intuitive in a way. Taking aim, the alignment of the line of sight with the line of fire. You place your eye along the aim of a rifle, and you fire along that similar line, at least in principle. Now, from the beginning of the 20th century, this taking of aim has become increasingly assisted by optical sights, allow the targeting of distant entities matched to the increased power and accuracy of the firearm. But a second order of targeting is to be found in the techniques of measurement by eye, through which the precise range from a weapon to a target can be optically determined. This is actually quite ancient. It developed alongside early modern gunnery in the early modern period, and it was used to visually determine the distance of a target to a weapon. So once you develop early cannons, it's a very pertinent question. How far is this target? And if I know how far this target is, I can set aim, or more effectively, I don't need corrective shots. I have a better chance of hitting my target. The way in which this works is really quite simple in many ways, at least to our minds. It employs the principles of trigonometry. If you recall your high school maths, trigonometry tells us that the measurements of the length of a base of a triangle and of the angles of sight from both ends of that base to the sighted point provide a distance to that point. So, in other words, if you measure a base, and here on this image you can see this is the distance between the 2 individuals taking sights, and you know the length of that base, and then you know the angles to the lines of sight from both positions, then you can work out the length of all the sides of the triangle, and therefore to the distance to the target. This was an important aspect, tool in early artillery. What's important here to realize, of course, is this participates in the wider correlated rationalization of vision and mathematization of space that was initiated in the early modern period. And here, linear perspectival representation occupies a central position. Because what linear perspective does, the mode of representation that we associate with the Renaissance and the great paintings of the time, is effectively a means by which you record the relative position and proportion of objects in a homogeneous and isotropic space. It mathematically correlates objective physical space and subjective vision. In other words, if an image is produced according to the laws of perspective, and it's done so faithfully, you can extract the relative sizes and positions of the objects within that scene, as seen from a very specific and unique the position of the viewer according to which this image is visually very similar. Now, of course, we know this largely in terms of in the history of art, but it has a much more fundamental place also within the history, the development of a mathematized and rationalized rationalization of vision and space. It lays down the foundations of a generalized theory of projective geometry that underpin contemporary techniques of photogrammetry, the measurement of space by photographs, and computer vision. So it's important to locate these techniques of ranging within a much wider cultural and scientific movement. Thereafter, we see the development of a range of technical systems for the automation of distance measurement. So once you've got these abstract principles, what you can do, or what you seek, is ways by which you automate it. You make it less burdensome, less reliant on individual human calculation. So the rangefinder is such a device. It's a complex assemblage of lenses and prisms, and in the first half of the 20th century was a very important tool for armed forces. It's effectively a long tube. A single individual can use it. You sight the targets, and you align the images in the viewpiece, and then you simply read off the machine the distance to the object you're sighting. So all the trigonometric calculations are being automated or mechanized by the rangefinder. But there's a third order of targeting, and this is the order of tracking. Because ranging is not sufficient when you're trying to target a fast-moving entity. So you can make a ranging measurement, but by the time you fired a weapon at that target or the position of that target may have moved from there. That became a particularly significant problem with the development of aircraft and the increasing speed of aircraft, which simply mean you can't visually target an aircraft. You've got to aim at a position, at a future position, at a position where you think the plane will be at the moment at which the projectile reaches it. So this creates complex fire control problems. You need to effectively compute the future position of the target. And how do you do this? You do it by continuously tracking it. In other words, if you track the movement of a target over a certain period of time, then you can make a reasonable prediction about where it might be in the future. But this is not something you can do intuitively. It's something that has to be mechanized because the speeds involved and the distance involved are ones that the human organism can't deal with. So a range of systems, such as gun directors and so on, become mechanisms by which they automate the calculation of the position of a future aircraft. And you do it by tracking. But what does tracking mean? It means effectively that the operator has to aim at the target with their eyes, follow it in space, and in doing so generate a data stream from which predictions can be automatically derived about the target's future behavior and position. But ultimately, tracking, and there were significant efforts made in the Second World War in particular to develop this tracking capability, and the whole science of cybernetics in many ways came out of the work of Norbert Wiener precisely on that tracking problem. But tracking was generally found ultimately to be insufficient. Against increasingly mobile targets, it's just not very reliable. It gives you some precision, but it's not sufficient. And therefore, the need for a fourth order of targeting emerges, and this is the order of guidance. Because what guidance entails is relocating elements of the targeting process into the projectile itself, thereby permitting the adjustment of the trajectory in mid-flight. So effectively, if you think of a missile, for example, if it's a guided missile, then the missile can keep adjusting its target, can keep tracking until the last moment. It is not dependent on a simply ballistic trajectory. You can illustrate this principle of guidance through a rather odd project of the Second World War. This is Project Pigeon, B.F. Skinner's Project Pigeon, so the famous psychologist who became quite well known for his operant conditioning of pigeons. Skinner's project during the Second World War was to develop a pigeon-guided missile system. Effectively, the way it worked was you would condition pigeons to peck at images of battleships by feeding them, by reinforcing the behavior. And once you had trained them sufficiently, you could put them in a warhead, fire the warhead at the ship, and as the pigeons would view the shape of the ship in there through the warhead, they would peck at it and eventually guide the missile to its destination. And here you have a video of a training exercise that they used in order to condition the pigeons. In the end, Project Pigeon was not seen through, but it provides, I think, a nice illustration of how the guidance principle works. Much more, in many ways, effective has been other means of guidance, for example, the use of infrared. And here I'm moving on to talking about some of the perceptual extensions that go beyond visible light. So these orders of targeting that I've been talking about, I think they work as general models. You can integrate them with various modes of perception. You can do it with simply visible light or telescopic vision, but you can also integrate it into a whole raft of other modes of perception. In many ways, these are the ones that have come to the fore in the second half of the 20th century. So infrared, of course, operates is on the electromagnetic spectrum, quite close to visible light, and involves heat detection and light amplification. And there's some early operational deployments in the Second World War, but has since now become an essential component of military operability. Infrared is crucial. It's crucial in the development of heat-seeking munitions, which are one of the important guidance systems, but also, perhaps even more importantly, in the provision of night vision. The US military likes to boast that we own the night, and it's quite clear that the capability for night operations is now an important dimension, if not a crucial dimension, of military power. Another crucial technology, of course, is that of radar. That's to say, the use of radio waves for determining the position and the movement of objects. Begun to be developed in the interwar years and became a major asset of anti-aircraft defenses in the Second World War. And the Allies had a clear advance on radar technology, and according to some accounts, this was perhaps the most crucial technological development of the Second World War, the one that was contributed most to the Allied victory. But there are other perceptual extensions that take part that don't involve the electromagnetic spectrum. Think, for example, of sound. Early anti-aircraft early warning systems relied on sound. So various, some more or less eccentric sound locating systems. The use, for example, of aborted use of sound mirrors. On the top right, you can find still around the UK these very vast concrete structures that were built as a way of providing an early warning system for aircraft. The sounds of the aircraft were going to be received by these giant sound mirrors, and calculations would be made on the basis that would provide the position of the aircraft. Sound ranging played an even more important role in the First World War for artillery location. So if you placed microphones at key positions and you linked them up and you processed the recordings, or you registered the recordings of the detonations of our enemy artillery, you could calculate to a high degree of precision the positions of enemy artillery. Now, sound technology and sound ranging is a technology that's been largely superseded by radars. Radars proved itself to be superior in most instances, but of course there is one domain in which sound technology and sound ranging is still crucial, and this is underwater, where radar simply doesn't work or has a very limited range, and so sonar is still the key technology, submarine technology, notably, for the extension of military perception in that domain. Finally, there's the technology of laser. And laser first developed in the 1960s out of radar, as a matter of fact, and it employs the stimulated emission of photons into tight directional beams of light, the properties of which have been recruited to fulfill the various targeting functions of detection, ranging, tracking, and guidance. This is the point I was making. You can apply any of these perceptual technologies to any mode of targeting. So, for example, we have laser range finding. So, optical range finding that I discussed earlier is also being displaced by laser range finding, which is a much more effective and far-ranging technology. But of course, laser can also be used for guidance. It's the most commonly used technology for missile and bomb guidance technology. And research is ongoing to adapt the technology to small arms munitions, so to make bullets laser guided. But crucially, laser can also be made to serve as a directed energy weapon. There are some long-standing efforts to develop laser technologies. For example, the anti-ballistic missile airborne laser. You've got images of that. Despite billions of dollars having been spent on it, this technology has still proved largely unsuccessful. But the drive to weaponize light continues because it appears to fulfill the convergence of perception with targeting so completely that it's, I think, to the military mind, quite irresistible. After all, laser travels in a straight line at the speed of light, so it does away with the problems of parabolic fire and the future position of mobile targets. You fire a laser, you don't need to track the target, you don't need to know where this target is going to be, because the light will reach it almost instantaneously. It ultimately brings the lethal beam of photons into coincidence with the visual ray. Exactly along the angle that you see, you can destroy. This hasn't yet happened, at least not meaningfully, but the efforts to do so are likely to continue. Let me now move on to the second function, that of imaging. And imaging corresponds to another facet of the automation of perception, in the sense that it supplements the capacity for sensorial perception with the ability to record it on a visual medium. The key landmark, of course, in imaging is the invention of the photographic process and the camera eye in the 1830s. And in many ways, it's important to realize that the invention of the photographic camera is the realization of the long-standing efforts to mechanize the production of perspectival images. So, discussed perspectival images already, but very quickly, there were attempts to find ways to produce these images, make the production of these images easier, because it's actually quite complicated to do it. You know, you need to know the rules of perspective. It's quite tedious. You've got to use geometric procedures that are quite tedious. So a whole range of machines were developed in order to try to automate the production or mechanize the production of perspectival images. The photographic camera is that device. So it appears in the mid-18th century, but it's not really until the turn of the century that the technology had sufficiently matured to be able to weigh significantly in the conduct of military operations. When it did, it would indeed weigh very heavily. It's its combination with the aerial viewpoint that has made photography such a crucial component of military power. In the First World War, we were faced very quickly with trench warfare, with a static front in which both sides scrutinized each other's defenses and attempted to make breakthroughs. So the aerial photography was a perfect instrument to deal with that particular situation. You could survey the enemy's defenses, their rear lines, take pictures, and bring them back to analysts who could extract valuable information, locate artillery, and produce maps. In the Second World War, this only developed further, particularly in the context of strategic bombing, that's to say the large-scale bombing targeted at the industry and the logistical basis of the enemy's military power. So photography allowed you to get a sense of what was the logistical infrastructure, where were key factories, where were defensive positions, and in order to instruct bombers as to what targets to go for. After the Second World War, in the Cold War, of course, the camera goes orbital, and we enter the age of satellite reconnaissance, which allowed states to photograph enemy territory without actually breaching their airspace. And this played a key role in the Cold War, and it was a central element of the policy of nuclear deterrence. Because the policy of nuclear deterrence is effectively to persuade your adversary that an attack is going to be, even a preemptive attack will be met by a devastating retaliation. But in order, and to do so, you need to match their military capability. In other words, the number of nuclear warheads that you have, nuclear bases, and so on. But we know from the early part of the Cold War that it was very difficult to know exactly what the enemy's capability was, and hence the fears about the bomber gap, the missile gap, and lots of paranoia about falling behind the enemy's capabilities. Aerial surveillance, satellite reconnaissance, and the images that this produced actually gave both sides much more accurate views of the enemy's capabilities. So it was a major stabilizing force of the nuclear deterrence system. That the ability to survey your enemy's capabilities and their developments, rather than to have to rely on more speculative intelligence accounts, fed into the system of nuclear deterrence and stabilized it. But this is also a period in which we go beyond photography. That's to say, we move into the era of remote sensing. That it's no longer about detecting visible light, although that's still an important dimension, but you end up using the detection of all propagated signals across the electromagnetic spectrum. So again, infrared, radar, and LiDAR, that's to say laser ranging, all of these become a key component of satellite reconnaissance. The concurrent and entangled with this spatial ungrounding of the mechanical eye, the image undergoes a process of digitization that denotes a fundamental shift in its underlying material ontology. One of its most profound effects is the rise of autonomous machine vision. So what happens in this period, of course, is that the image becomes digital. It becomes computerized. It becomes numbered. So photography used to be a chemical process. It becomes a digital one. One of the implications of this is that it greatly assists the algorithmic processing of imagery. You can feed it through algorithms much more effectively, much faster, and you can automate the extraction of numerical and symbolic information. In other words, you can make machines see, or at least you can try to make machines see. And this is used in a number of ways. So, for example, cruise missiles, such as the Tomahawk, use scene matching technology in their terminal phase. So that's to say that when a Tomahawk missile or cruise missile approaches its target, what it does is it contrasts the images that it's receiving through its camera with the pictures that are stored in its memory. And it uses that to match these pictures and to adjust its trajectory if it needs to do so. Of course, there's also increased speculation about the role or the rise of autonomous killer robots, as to say, machines that might not simply be able to recognize a target. So, for example, in the case of a cruise missile, all it's doing is looking for a target it's been told is there, and it's trying to recognize it. But in the future, of course, we may have machines that might autonomously identify a target, say, this is a target, and I'm going to take the decision autonomously to target it. I think there are still quite considerable technical obstacles to that, but certainly there are growing and sustained efforts to develop this technology. But there's another aspect of the digitization of imaging, and that's that military operators become increasingly placed within synthetic visual environments through an array of augmented and virtual reality displays. Think, for example, the helmet-mounted display or the heads-up display. These are displays that are either in a cockpit or directly on the helmet, which convey to the pilot loads of contextual information. So it might be altitude, the location of a target, but it can also map on top of it virtual images. So if you look at the helmet heads-up display in the bottom right, what you are actually seeing here is what's called a synthetic visual display, where it's showing you a virtual image of the land, of the environment just outside the cockpit. And for example, you might use it if the weather conditions are very poor and you can't see much out of the window. You could just fly by looking at the synthetic vision display. And this is a technology that's increasingly deployed not only in military but also in civilian contexts. Of course, the endpoint of that technology might well be the full abstraction of an environment into a fully synthetic representation optimized for human cognition and decision making. This is something that was already attempted as early as the 1980s in the project that became referred to as Super Cockpit. The idea originally was, well, let's develop a virtual cockpit that we could use to test cockpit cockpit layouts. You know, how we might put all different instruments, and we might test them virtually rather than have to build the cockpits. But eventually, the research moved on to the idea that, well, actually, maybe you could make the visual displays more effective. Maybe you could fly the aircraft all together just by looking at the simulation. And perhaps the simulation might abstract the environment to such an extent that it might be a more effective way of flying. And here's a kind of mock-up of the Super Cockpit display, where you can see the environment being mapped, the landscape, but also the position of other aircraft, anti-aircraft defenses, and so on. So this is a project, again, that didn't go beyond the research phase, but inherently, I think, displays the logic of the synthetic visual display. So the point here, I think, to bear in mind is that as we move into digitization of imaging, it involves both, I think, the autonomization of vision, that's to say vision becomes something that machines can do, but also that individuals become increasingly submerged in synthetic visual environments. So the human is still there, but it's increasingly married and coupled to synthetic visual displays. This brings us to mapping. And here we go back a bit to think about the representation of geographic space and the position and motion of entities within it, an important component of the Marshall gaze. Now, maps, of course, have played an important role in the expanding governance of early modern states. Colonization and so on has been narrated by a number of accounts, embedded in this development of the Mercator map and other forms of scientific cartography. But until the late 19th century, maps were restricted essentially to assisting the strategic movement and operational battlefield deployment of troops. There were virtually no tactical uses made of maps outside of the particular case of siege warfare. But this changes dramatically in the 20th century for two main reasons. The first is that in the past, generals could usually see the entire battlefield. The areas in which combat and operations took place began to extend immeasurably, such as that command decisions had to be made with reference to cartographic representations. So you could no longer be a general standing on a hill and viewing the battle. You had to be in the rear looking at maps and communicating your orders. So maps become important tactical instruments. But the second reason is that the extension in the range and accuracy of artillery fire allowed distant targets that could not be directly observed to be struck if their geospatial coordinates were known. So this is the development of what's known as indirect fire. Direct fire is when you fire or target an entity that you can see from the position of the weapon system. Indirect fire is where you have no direct perception or vision of the target, and maps can be an important way to conduct indirect fire if you know how to translate cartographic coordinates into artillery instructions. Once again, the First World War is a key moment. It brought about an intense surveying and cartographic effort. Britain printed 34 million war maps, France over 30 million, and Germany no less than a staggering 775 million. But also in this period, what we see is the introduction of gridding to allow for unique spatial coordinates of any point to be read off. So the point is, you could look at a map like this one, and you could read a position off it, and you've got a geographic coordinate. And you can translate that then into an artillery instruction. Target this particular position on the map. This allows new tactical developments. So map shooting, that's what I've just described, but also so-called creeping barrage. So this is an army barrage map. What this is effectively an instruction for is the coordination of artillery fire. So you're going to have artillery is going to fire in the coordinated fashion along the lines that you can see at determined intervals. Every 5-10 minutes, you move up the rungs of that ladder. The idea being that because you're going to fire simultaneously, you're going to disrupt the defenses, and you're going to allow enemy friendly troops to move in just behind the artillery or the barrage line, and therefore maximize the surprise effect or take advantage of the disarray of the defenses. This gridding of the battle space for the purpose of fire control would eventually come to encompass the entire planet under the impulse of the preparation for global nuclear war. So, and this is one of the outcomes of unprecedented cartographic and geodetic efforts expended after the Second World War. So by the end of the Second World War, this kind of gridding and intensive mapping had been conducted, as I just discussed in the First World War, but it was conducted only in particular areas where there was military combat, where you might need to fire artillery or to direct other forms of force. But of course, once you're faced with the prospect of a global nuclear war, and you may have to target missiles at positions on the other side of the globe, you are going to need much more accurate maps of the entire planet than had ever existed until then. One of the outcomes, therefore, of these efforts that took place in the decades following the Second World War was this development of the so-called Universal Transverse Mercator projection, which supports a two-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system for the location of any point on the globe. This coordinate system is used today by the US and NATO and allows for the designation of a unique rectangular grid coordinate for any position on the globe, all the way from 100,000 meter grid squares to 1 meter grid square. So you can locate positions on the globe within a single square meter. This global coordinate system is also used by the GPS space-based satellite navigation system, which employs an array of orbiting satellites to provide any receiver its accurate position anywhere on the planet. So in other words, when you use your GPS and it gives you a location, it's doing it by reference to this coordinate system. I mean, then it can be translated into various other systems, but the basic geodetic system is that very one that was developed through American military efforts. And GPS, of course, today is a mission-critical component of military operations, a vital enabler of the present American vision of high precision and low risk warfare. Now, satellites don't simply provide geopositional guidance, they also provide, for example, terrain contour maps. So they can record in great detail the elevation of terrain, and they produce streams of data that then can be essential components to modern weapon systems. So, for example, the cruise missile, I've just talked about the cruise missile already a little bit. I talked about the guidance system, but actually the cruise missile uses several systems, guidance systems. And another one it uses is what's called terrain contour matching. What it does is it takes a digital elevation map expressed as a matrix of relative changes in altitude to ground level, and it correlates periodically this digital elevation map that gets stored in his memory with its own altimetric measurements as it proceeds along its flight course. So periodically, it measures the distance, the distance to the ground, and it checks that this data fits with the information that it has on board. And this gives it, of course, much greater accuracy. Discrepancies between expected and actual measurements lead to corresponding adjustments by the flight control mechanism, compensating for any drifts in the missile's guidance. This increased accuracy allows the cruise missile to maintain high speeds at very low altitudes and even wave circuitous paths to its target, reducing its exposure to radar detection and air defenses. I talked already about the role of digitization, or the effects of digitization on imaging, but digitization is also concurrently transforming mapping to the extent that we really increasingly can't talk about maps. We have to talk about geographic information systems. That's to say that the map, in its traditional understanding as a static or at least punctuated visual representation of space, is giving way to systems for the dynamic representation and interfacing of repositories of geospatial data that exist in states of continuous flux through their various data feeds and calculative operations. So here, for example, we have one of the important geographic information system projects of the US Army, the so-called Command Post of the Future, where it's using geographic information systems to allow officers who will provide guidance to troops on the ground to effectively interact with geospatial data, continuously updating maps, tailoring the maps to the information, drawing correlations between bits of information, so that there is no single map. There are lots of different versions of maps, and there's geospatial databases that are being continuously updated by automatic data streams, but also the actions of their operators. So where does this survey of the logistics of military perception leave us? What are its concrete effects on the application of military force and the security landscape? Well, I want to argue that the Marshall Gaze is instrumental in ushering in an age of global targeting. Perhaps the most striking illustration of global targeting is an ongoing US defense project called the Prompt Global Strike. Prompt Global Strike is a system being developed for the delivery of conventional precision weapons anywhere in the world within an hour. So today, of course, the US could target, so could a few other states could target nuclear missiles over continental distances. But of course, these are not precision weapons whatsoever. This is the idea of using a conventional precision weapon and for it to be able to be targeted anywhere within a single hour. So the ways in which that might happen is still up for grabs. There's various strands or streams of research that involve hypersonic delivery vehicles or space-based kinetic weapons. But regardless of the ways in which this will be implemented, it will, of course, have to rely on the logistics and development of the logistics of military perception that we've talked about. And if such a vision is even possible, it's precisely because of the ability to correlate global perception with global targeting. But global targeting does not only refer to its planetary scale, although I think that is an important dimension. It also reflects its increasingly granular character. Because the more it is possible to identify and precisely locate discrete identities remotely, the greater the tendency towards the individualization of targeting, according to the entity's identity or known functions. We already see this in the recent deployments of drones, notably in northern Pakistan, where targeting is conducted against high-value targets on the one hand, individuals that the US knows and has identified for a long period, and so-called signature strikes, where individuals are targeted whose identities are not known, but whose patterns of behavior are deemed to be suspicious. But effectively, what's important is that these are tactics or strikes that are individualized, particularly in the degree of granularity that it permits allows the targeting of these individuals. Of course, there's, as we know, there are civilians and so on who get caught up in it, but the drive is quite clear towards individualization of targeting. And with that, there's a move towards the application of force wherever the target is. So if you think about it, targeting used to typically occur within defined battle spaces or kill boxes. You'd have a space and you define it as a battle space, and within it, force could be unleashed. Increasingly, what we're seeing is targeting just the space of targeting is led by the target. Wherever the target is, since we can see it wherever it is, increasingly, this is where force can be delivered. And the consequence of this is quite simply the disappearance of the battlefield. In the sense that the battlefield is a space that was distinct from the non-battlefield, if you want, no longer stands, or increasingly doesn't hold. What we have, another way of saying that is that there's a global battlefield, but if there's a global battlefield, it's the same thing as to say that there is no battlefield anymore. Targeting increasingly can be conducted anywhere, and we see the logic of that, of course, in the recent uses of drones. But of course, the more visibility becomes synonymous with death, the greater become the efforts expended to render oneself imperceptible within the battle space. And this brings us to the last element that I was talking about at the outset, the dimension of hiding. That's to say, all the various means that have been deployed and are being deployed to evade, misdirect, or confuse the martial gaze. This may involve various forms of camouflage or stealth. Effectively, stealth is simply camouflage that's conducted outside or beyond simply the visual realm into the entire electromagnetic spectrum. All of these, both camouflage and stealth, are really simply trying to dissimulate the perceptual signature of a valued target. The logistics of perception, the martial gaze is scanning the space, if you want, to find or to recognize entities that are defined already in terms of having a certain signature. Camouflage and stealth simply attempt to dissimulate that signature. But there are other techniques such as decoys, in which case you simulate the perceptual signature of a valued target. You want to draw the gaze towards something that it isn't. It looks like what the gaze wants to see or wants to recognize, but in fact isn't, and therefore distracts it from the real position or the real location of the desired target. There are also techniques of what we might call bedazzlement. That's to say, where you try to blind the martial gaze by jamming, by using chaff, by effectively overloading the gaze with information so that it can no longer distinguish valued targets from anything else. Now, all these countermeasures, and this is currently what I'm working on, so this is live research at the moment for me. These countermeasures resist the martial gaze, but they also actively participate in its further development. Because, of course, for any countermeasure that is developed, new developments in the martial gaze follow in order to counter them. We are in a continuous cycle of action-reaction, which is a key dynamic within war, so that the various means of hiding may counter the gaze, but in many cases also advance it. But we can, I think, also see a more fundamental strategic response to the martial gaze deadly reach in the adoption of strategies of generalized concealment and dispersion. By this I mean various attempts or efforts to shift the area of operations to environments in which the socio-technical assemblages of perception perform less advantageously. Now, for some time, of course, as asymmetric forces, let's say weaker forces, facing more powerful forces that have perhaps a monopoly or dominance of the means of perception, these weaker forces, whereas asymmetric forces, have long adopted the jungle or the mountain as propitious terrain. More recently, the city. That's to say, areas where the means of military perception are less effective, where there's concealment, geographic concealment, landscape concealment, or simply the clutter or the density of population. But increasingly, we are seeing belligerents concealing themselves and operating at the very heart of the domestic societies of their adversaries. This, I think, is a correlate of the disappearance of the battlefield engendered by global targeting. If there's no longer a clear space of the battlefield, it increasingly becomes a logical consequence that adversaries will locate themselves at the very heart of their enemies' societies. I think it's in that light, for example, that we can see developments or the recent events in Paris and Belgium. This is not entirely new, of course, but it brings it into sharper relief, where we have individuals, groups that are deeply embedded in the societies that they're targeting, but they, of course, who represent an extension of a conflict that is global, that manifests itself in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, taking very complex networked forms. But crucially here, individuals who are capable then of turning the otherwise pacified urban space into a zone of war at an instant. I think here Reza Negarestani's notion of hyper-camouflage I think is very pertinent. In that article where he talks about the endo-militarization of peace, again, I think see this idea here being instantiated. In the absence of a conventional battlefield, in the increasing dominance or ability of perception to scan the globe, we see also strategic responses that are changing the nature of war, at least the expressions of war that we've been used to seeing, both as state-bound but also as being spatially and temporally delineated. So war used to be a moment that has a beginning and an end. It used to be spatially circumscribed, zones of war, zones of peace. That seems to be falling apart, disintegrating in the early 21st century. The spatiality and the temporality of war have become a lot more uncertain. But there's a final consequence, perhaps, to that, because it suggests that the martial gaze is likely to be increasingly turned inward upon the very societies that erected it. So in other words, if the battlefield and the battle space disappears, if the adversaries of the advanced militaries increasingly conceal themselves within the domestic societies of these militaries, then we should not be surprised if the martial gaze that traditionally was projected outwards towards the enemy societies, or the enemy's military and then the enemy societies, we shouldn't be surprised if that gaze increasingly becomes turned inward at the very societies that have developed that gaze in the first place. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you. I can't hear you.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. So let me just I had a couple questions. Let's see. I guess my first question is, I mean, you ended by talking about hiding and strategies of sort of kind of hyper embedment in that kind of thing. And I'm just kind of wondering also, what about the use of GPS and the use of some of these technologies, not just as something to hide from, but actually being used by the quote-unquote enemy? Are there ways in which that is happening, in which these exactly the same tools are being reversed and sort of repurposed, and not only by entities that we would, you know, probably strongly disagree with, but perhaps by you know, kind of anti-capitalist forces and other sort of left progressive things like that. I mean, there's the obvious ones with like social media and that kind of thing, but I'm thinking more of the kind of abstractional technologies that you're talking about. Are there some examples of inversion of that are that we might pay attention to?
Yes, I mean, there's definitely forms of appropriation of these technologies, and a lot of the technologies that I've charted have all started their lives as military technologies, but become progressively civilianized, or at least diffused through society. So you're right about GPS. GPS was a military technology for a long time, and now everyone has a GPS receiver in their pockets. Geographic information systems, largely developed in the intelligence or military sector. That history is actually very obscure. We don't know a lot about it. We know about the civilian side, but we don't know much about the military side. But that increasingly is also becoming available to individuals, whether it's activists or other types of groups, and who are able to make use of the data and to produce connections and so on. So yes, I think there's all sorts of modes of appropriation that are significant, and that also goes with the modes of camouflage as well. But there remains, of course, some significant asymmetries. I mean, the technology moves on, and of course, and advanced militaries continue to have a certain lead, and well, I think it's a mixed picture. I think for states, it's also about technology that do escape their control. So GPS is I think a very interesting model, because technically the US military could switch off GPS, but that's a very drastic measure that it's very unlikely to want to do, because it would, the economic consequences, the knock-on effects are probably too huge to countenance. So effectively, we've moved into a GPS era where anyone can locate anyone anywhere. But it's clear that what has been a US military monopoly is now extended to other defense organizations, but also can be weaponized, and I put that in both ways that we might think are more favorable and more negatively by other entities. And likewise, aerial surveillance is becoming now ubiquitous with the drone. Everyone can basically get a device that can conduct aerial surveillance, and we see the problems that raises about privacy and so on. So yes, there's a kind of conveyor belt that sees a lot of this technology become civilianized. What the net effect of that, I think, is very difficult to tell. And there are groups that will use it in means that we might see as more positive, and others less. But that gets into a bigger debate, I think, about the role of surveillance and also counter-surveillance. And so if we live in societies that are under increasing surveillance, is perhaps one of the only measures that's left to us is to the extent that it's possible, to watch the watchers.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking there's a section in 1,000 Plateaus where Deleuze talks about probe heads. He talks about probe heads, and I looked this up, and I was trying to understand what he could possibly be referring to, and it did appear that he was talking about GPS essentially. So here's a quote. I'm getting a feedback here.
I can hear you okay.
Okay. I'm just going to turn yours down for a minute while I talk, because I'm just getting. I'll turn you back up in just a second because I'm getting an echo. So here's a quote from my essay in the book Deleuze and Race, where I talk about that. I say this is talking about Deleuze's concept of the face. The only way to dismantle the face in its hierarchical form is from within, imminently transforming its molar significance into molecular asignificance by moving beyond the two visages of sovereignty as well as the negative inverse of the image of body and head. Neither the essentialist return to the primitive head or the noble savage and the noble savage, nor the mere acceptance of the national face, but the creative affirmation of what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as probe heads. In other words, automatic guiding devices that, like a GPS system, search for possible routes within specific givens, piloting fluxes molecularly within the immanence of the already existing to enable lines of deterritorialization, positive and absolute. So, I guess the reason I was reciting that was just because trying to think of how we can think of this type of mapping and sort of virtualization of space as something that could be used, that could be repurposed in some way. And I think the example that you mentioned with drones and that sort of thing is a good example. I know that you've probably seen the images from Poland. There was a protest where I guess protesters used a aerial drone for basically to surveil where the police were, and then they would rearrange where the protesters were going based on where the riot cops were going and that kind of thing. So there's definitely some examples like that. I'm going to turn yours back up and then turn it over to somebody else who wants to raise a question.
Well, I mean, I'll just say that I think that this, it opens surveillance and optics and all these various modes of perception opens up fields of power that are going to be contested in one way or another. And well, targeting is partly what interests me is to show that many of these technologies have historical have military origins, but targeting, of course, could be used in peaceful ways. Targeting is, in military context, is a direction of force, coercion onto a particular point, position in space and time. But you could also use that to direct resources, to direct, energy or whatever it might be to particular positions. And that's clearly going to be one of the resources that any political movement is going to have to make use, and any kind of polity or collectivity is going to make use in the world that we live in today. So the logistics of perception is also logistics more widely understood.
Somebody else want to ask a question?
I can't hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, hi Antoine. That was a fantastic presentation. And I wanted to talk a question specifically about the implementation of innovation in the military-state complex. What comes first, implementation of innovation in the military-state complex, or implementation in everyday life, everyday media? Is it possible that citizen innovation aids in some way the military gaze? Can't hear you.
Sorry. Can you hear me now? Yeah. No, do you have do you want to illustrate the last point you were making? I mean, how would it work the other way around? Do you have something in mind?
Can you hear me now? No.
Did you hear my question?
Yes, I heard your question. Well, like, for example, what happens there's a nice book called The Entrepreneurial State that talks about how governments put a lot of money into innovation, into Apple, and right now it's STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and they use that to sort of prototype the next engineers, and those engineers are not exactly like doing citizen science. They are doing things for the military-state complex. So what I wanted to know is that in your research, have you located any examples of this where citizen innovation, for example, new ways of mapping, new ways of seeing and sensing, have aided in some way the military gaze? Because I see that sometimes in makerspaces or hackerspaces, innovations in different kinds of media that start off as relatively, how should I put this, naive ways of inventing new media, and then they become kind of co-opted by the military or the state gaze, so to speak. I don't know. Can't hear you. Okay.
Yeah. Am I on? Okay. That's a very good question, and I think you touched on to something that's a very important feature, which is this. this change, I think, in civil-military relations in many ways. So, if you think about the first half of the 20th century, where many key developments occurred, in many ways what happened is you had mobilization that took place in the First and the Second World War, and civilians were brought into the military fold and to solve the problems that the military had at that moment. But what's quite clear is that a lot of times, particularly after the First World War, that everything was kind of disbanded after the First World War. So all these things just kind of stopped almost overnight. There was genuine kind of demilitarization following it. And it's why in the build-up to the Second World War, they basically have to cobble everything back from scratch. I think it's a different story after the Second World War, and that's the context, I think, of the Cold War that's now fed into the war on terror, where we don't have full mobilization, so we haven't re-experienced something like the First and the Second World War, but we've got a much more long-standing and kind of deeper-rooted military, industrial, scientific complex, however you want to call it, but it's a much more civilianized complex. So a lot of what is going on is being developed. The old conveyor belt from the military to the civilian is now, to some extent, reversed. And actually, that's happened particularly in the last few decades. So, if you look at, for example, information technology, early computer science, largely military funded, and that's how it basically kick-started the information technology industry. But today, actually, a lot of innovations are coming from the civilian sector, and it's the military that's trying to catch up. And they're getting their ideas and they're getting their technology, sometimes off the shelf, from civilian technologies. This happens and from private companies that have big activities that are civilian and then some military activities. To the extent it's becoming very difficult to even distinguish clearly, what civilian and military activities are in the areas of mapping, of imaging, and so on. And that's particularly, I think, intensified by the convergence of all these fields, because one of the things that digitization is doing is that it's dissolving the distinction. The systems you're looking at now are simultaneously sensing, imaging, mapping systems at the same time, and generally with forms of automated or autonomous cognition that's being embedded in it. So I think that the military is very aware of that, and it draws on the expertise that is being developed elsewhere, and I think that creates a very difficult question about what militarization and what demilitarization means today, because to a large extent we live under a kind of different kind of militarization than we have in the past, but in lots of ways most of the major corporations are embedded in some of these important technological developments. Google, Microsoft, Apple, all these companies are, I think, are players in their own respective ways. So yes, I think there are lots of developments that are happening in the civilian sector, notably in geographic information systems, that are being ported. So big data, for example, is a good example. I think big data has been quite often a civilian activity. There's, of course, there are intelligence and defense areas, but there are innovations that are definitely happening in the civilian sector that are being ported into the military, and the military is very attentive to that today.
Mm-hmm. And you said the second thing that caught my attention is that you said that this research was ongoing. I think when it came out, I devoured this book. I devoured Benjamin Bratton's The Stack. I think you work within some of the same frames. I think for the research that you're pursuing, I think it would really, I'm trying just to think about the whole presentation in terms of Bratton's Stack, and I think there are some really, really productive conjunctions there. I would really recommend it.
It's on my list. I definitely need to read that book. I've had my eye on it for a while, so yes, I'm sure that'll be productive.
Just a note, Giancarlo is going to be going to Birkbeck pretty soon. So you guys will get a chance to meet probably.
Reach out to me and we'll grab a coffee or whatever.
Maybe Siddhartha, would you like to say anything?
For sure, for sure.
I can't hear you. Is Siddhartha speaking? Because I can't hear him.
No. How do we
there.
do this, Jason? Should he? Can you hear me now?
Yep, yep.
Okay. This is slightly unconsidered, so forgive me for this. But one of the things that I've been grappling with, especially in this kind of oversaturated coverage of this issue, is this notion of ubiquitous surveillance. You know, and we've had a very nice, we've come to a point in intellectual itinerary where we have a very nice, we have come to realize how we got here. We understand how we got here. We have certain vectors that we come through. But how? I mean, how do we resist it in terms of, not in terms of resisting, but intellectually? Where are we going with ubiquitous surveillance? I mean, once we completely map the globe, the ecosphere, what are we doing? I mean, what are the non-surveil, like, what are the surveilled subjects doing or thinking about this? And how can we think about this? I mean, like, if something is ubiquitous, where else can we go? Where else can thought go?
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a big question, of course.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid I don't have any. You know, I think there are some fairly. You know, there's some fairly uncomfortable aspects about the narrative that I'm proposing, and I'm not sure that they're easy responses to it or solutions.
Right.
One thing, I mean, I'm going to latch onto this question about subjects, because I think one of the things that comes out for me is the question of who the subjects are here, and to some extent, I feel that the subject, that there's a kind of inhuman subjectivity at heart of this. You know, what is the martial gaze? Is it, you know, what strikes me about a lot of what I've seen is that it's a reconfiguration of the human organism within these systems of perception, where the organism is entrained and is marshaled and is instrumentalized for the purpose of targeting or military perception, so that perception is no longer simply a kind of embodied individual phenomena, but becomes objectified so that it can be translated into its various frameworks, so that you can correlate the situated perception of an individual with a kind of disembodied mapping, striation of space and the exercise of force within it. And part of that becomes, part of that cognition and perception is autonomous, or happens in which human actors are very deeply, increasingly deeply embedded in it. And you have a process of targeting that, if you take a bleak perspective of it, in some ways is almost its own, is its own self-motivation. That's to say, you've got a system for perceiving and targeting, and that's what it does. And it needs to find new targets and to deliver new force. So there is a kind of a serious question here about what we do about that. And perhaps the only response, I suppose, that I can think of is that there is a counter conduct, which is the conduct of hiding, right? That we may have to find, you know, so that takes different forms, but that's perhaps the only form of resistance that exists to surveillance, to that gaze. But I don't think it doesn't offer any kind of simple solution to the situation in which we're in, and the prospect of global targeting and the dissolution of the battlefield, I think, is something that should concern us. I mean, war has been pretty ugly for a long time, but the prospect of no longer even being able to distinguish between spheres of war and peace is probably not something to be particularly enthusiastic about.
No, that's why I was quite both heartened and relieved that someone like these Brussels bombers could stay hidden within a 2-kilometer radius, 3-kilometer radius for 3 months. But after some time, even you get sucked in. So you need networks, I guess. You need filial networks. You need to go back to tribalism.
No, the response, of course, is, well, oh, there's the intelligence services have failed. So what can we do so that this doesn't happen again? So it pushes. It will then stimulate new means of surveillance, new extensions of perception. That's the kind of treadmill we're on, I think, unfortunately.
No, precisely. Yeah.
What are some of those things, Antoine? What are some of those responses that we might expect to come out of Paris and Brussels in terms of extending the sort of GIS and other types of imaging, but extending them more inward in kind of like the heart of the industrialized North and that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, some of it might just take technological routes. So, you know, it might be the use of drones or, you know, other forms of technology. And some of it, I think, may have to do with the attempts to penetrate social networks or electronic communications. Closer, I think, to perhaps tactics that we associate with counterinsurgency, which are not always necessarily the most high-tech techniques, but ultimately involve using the framework and the mindset of war to policing. So I think one of the very clear symptoms of this dissolution of the battlefield and the spaces of peace and war is the convergence of policing and military. So that increasingly armed forces, military forces are expected to serve policing functions, and counterinsurgency is largely is a combination of conventional warfighting with policing, but also increasingly domestic policing being militarized. The most visible end, of course, is the riot gears and the equipment that takes on the more military guise, but also perhaps the ways in which you treat the you think of what used to be the category of the criminal in a more hostile kind of mode.
Daniel, do you want to throw anything in?
Yeah, thank you. I was just interested in, let's say, the dimension of colonialism that Derek Gregory mentions in his article. This whole, let's say, techno-cultural apparatus of rendering the battlefield and generating information from it, I don't know, has also like a very specific and incisive colonial dimension, where he mentions that the expansion to the whole globe of this, let's say, military gaze, as you call it, doesn't have a possibility of including other cultures and other spaces, even though it's reproducing them, let's say, digitally. You know, he speaks about this example of a commando or an operation that thinks that there's a military target that they have to attack, and after they attack it, they find out it's just kids and women praying and going to the school and making, everyday activities. So this very difficult distinction between enemy and civilian is totally blurred. And maybe the main problem with this is that there is no such thing as the other or the foreign subject that is being understood, and and the context of the outside is totally eliminated. So what would be the implications for this? You know, the expansion of, let's say, homogeneous space of perception that is deeply embedded in, let's say, imperial context, you know, or inside an imperial culture.
To the previous question, because you know, a number of scholars have already observed how certain techniques were first developed in the colonial context before returning to the imperial centers. So, for example, whether it's the practice of fingerprinting or identity cards, these are things that were developed and mandated first in the colonial context before they became adopted in the metropolitan imperial centers. And I think, you know, the connection with the previous question is, well, if we want to see perhaps some of the things that may come, we can look at what the US and others did in Afghanistan and Iraq when they were conducting counterinsurgency. You know, use of iris scans, biometric data. These are techniques that have been tried out in these contexts that may well then come back here. And of course, there is a colonial context in, you know, events in Brussels and Belgium, where of course the individuals involved are from the former colonies, and so there's there is a kind of a legacy of colonialism. There's a racial dimension that plays into that. So these techniques, not to mention of course the conduct of drone strikes and so on. So there is definitely a kind of north-south context. There is a colonial or post-colonial context in which this surveillance or this military perception takes place, and undoubtedly the spheres in which it's been, certainly in the last 100 years or so, the spheres in which some of it has been applied, particularly perhaps in the post Second World War period, has been in the global South, with eventually, I think, what some people called, you know, the Foucault's boomerang, the fact that many of these weapons or these systems are developed and deployed there, but also come back to the societies that sent them in the first place.
How about Roland? Would you like to say anything?
Yeah, hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. I have not so much a question, but a thought in regard to the point you made about the increasing autonomization of the process of making a target, especially with regard to machine vision, where, like, even though the target hasn't been identified, the machine can identify the pattern and calculate the possibility of that target for being a real threatening target. Because I was really interested in the use of statistical modeling in these kind of process. Of course, this is where, like, mistake can be made, like making identify the wrong target, where there are a lot of ethical issues, political issues hinge upon. But I also wonder, in regard to the part about countermeasures you mentioned, especially obfuscatory techniques. I researched a little bit on the kind of obfuscatory techniques used on social media in Chinese context, where people use, like, strange language characters in order to evade kind of machine recognition of their patterns, of the pattern of their language, you know, where they use match words to identify sensitive information. So I was very interested in how successful these kind of techniques, countermeasures, would be. But then I realized that it's also a matter of statistics, because it doesn't really matter if you by using a very clever metaphor or something, you can evade censorship. But most of the time, people couldn't do that. So it's also a matter of statistics that how we can measure the success of these kind of countermeasures. So that's one way I was thinking about this. So basically, I wonder if you could talk more about the intersection of the use of statistics and the development of martial gaze.
Well, when it comes to countermeasures, I mean, what's interesting in the history of camouflage and that I've been looking at is that, as actually in the other dimensions, there's an increasing attempt to develop scientific methods. And effectively, so one of the things that the study of camouflage and scientific development of camouflage involves is studying the vulnerabilities, the biases, the fallibilities of human perception. Because if you know the kinds of things that the human organism can see or tends to see or perceive or not locate, then you develop accordingly camouflage. If you know the human visual system works in this way and tends to recognize such forms and not others, then you develop camouflage in accordance with it. So countermeasures always kind of rely on a knowledge, could be scientific or not, but a knowledge of the ways in which the organisms perceive, or the modes of perception, and therefore what it doesn't see, the imperception. The goal is to become imperceptible, so to speak. But of course, increasingly, because the organs of perception are not human anymore, they can be machines and they can be processed by algorithms. Then increasingly, what you need to fool is the algorithm. So you need to understand what the algorithm is, and you need to work out what will fool the algorithm, what will mislead that algorithm. Onto your point on statistics, I mean, I think that's important because I would link statistics to ideas of probability and risk, because I think that's becoming a very important dimension of the ways in which force and security is being conceived today. We've increasingly moved towards logics of preemption. That's to say, we don't wait until the enemy strikes. We've got to detect the enemy before their action is realized, and therefore we have to anticipate the risk of their conduct of future actions. And the entire basis of drones, the entire rationale for drone strikes in Pakistan, notably, is to argue that individuals are going to be targeted if the judgment is made that they will present a future threat to the United States, even however remote or however abstract and theoretical that threat might be. And of course, by necessity, when we're dealing with statistics, probabilities, and risk, we're dealing with imponderables, with threats that may not manifest themselves. But the risk logic, I think, has become increasingly important. And part of that, I think, is because, and I think it's important to understand the kind of cultural, socio-cultural context in which that drives, above all the US, but perhaps more widely the developed states, drives them to adopt these technologies is, they're trying to effectively triangulate several factors. Firstly, that Western and US states want to continue to exert military power. They don't want to get out of the war game, which would be one option. But secondly, they want to do so. They have a very low tolerance for casualties. The contemporary modern militaries are extremely casualty averse. They don't want to lose. They don't want to lose men. They think political will be and popular support will seriously undermine if the bodies start coming in, and that's how you understand the whole policy of drone strikes, basically, in order not to put any boots on the ground, not to even to risk a single casualty. And so that drives the adoption of technology, which is seen as a solution for that. Automate, autonomize, get humans out of the loop as much as possible, or at least out of harm's way, not the loop, and simultaneously adopt risk postures where you preempt and you try to neutralize threats before they materialize themselves. So there's a statistical and probabilistic dimension that is, I think, crucial the way in which force is being used, and that participates in this dissolution of the battlefield, because you're now trying to neutralize threats that don't exist. You're trying to use force before you have to be, before you are yourself confronted with force.
I had one more question.
Mm-hmm.
Gonna turn it down. Okay, so this is kind of a three-part question, but it's really more or less one ultimate question. So basically, what I'm curious about is in your in some of what you said in your talk, but also in your in that blog essay that you sent that was kind of summarizing the ISA presentation that you gave. You talk about post-colonial approaches, aesthetic approaches, ideological approaches to kind of the analysis of cartography in various ways, and talking about how, for example, aesthetic and ideological approaches ignore that some of the distortions of content size and that sort of thing in mapping were really primarily instrumental projects rather than aesthetic or ideological, or reducible purely to colonial kind of distortions. And so I'm just curious if you could maybe say a little bit about what you think the limits are of some post-colonial theory, aesthetic theory, ideological theory in relation to this, and what are the benefits of the approach that you use, comparatively speaking? And then also in relation to Virilio, insofar as you're looking at kind of statistics and triangulation and that sort of thing, to some extent, I'm curious. Are you in some ways trying to question the kind of phenomenological assumptions that we find in Virilio, and sort of doing a somewhat similar project, but in a non-phenomenological manner?
Okay. Well, the point I was trying to make about cartography was simply that. So when I was dealing with the challenge of this project is actually I've had to deal with very different literatures in media theory, in geography, in social science and technology studies, and so on. And when I approached the subject of mapping and geography, what I saw a lot of was it came across a lot of the work that's been going on in critical geography and critical cartography. A lot of it is which is very interesting, but I think the debate that's animated that field has been, on the one hand, you've got the scientific cartographers who say, well, we make scientific maps and they're perfectly accurate and value neutral and objective and so on. And then all the critical geographers say, hang on a minute, you're forgetting about the biases here, the ideology, the culture that's being that's being smuggled through. These are not objective natural maps and so on. And I think I absolutely take that point. I agree with it. But I think the problem with that argument has been, and I'm not saying that as a way of saying that we shouldn't, that these critiques are not valid, but that then we lose sight of the fact that there is a kind of instrumental, pragmatic aspect to maps. That they also serve functional purposes within wider systems. That some maps may be rhetorical. So you draw a map to say this is our land. This has an ideological function. But a military that doesn't really hold that well with a military map. What I mean by that is, if you made an ideological military map that basically gave the inaccurate geospatial data, then that wouldn't be a very useful map to the military operative. That's not to say that I believe that there are scientific maps that are objective. I simply believe that there are maps that serve functions. There's a pragmatics of the map. And if the map is being used for targeting, then it's beneficial for it to convey information that will make the targeting more effective. and some of the ideological and rhetorical dimensions are going to be secondary and certainly potentially get in the way of that particular function. So, the example I used in the article is the Mercator map, because there's a lot of controversy about the Mercator map. It's a projection, and all projections of a globe into a two-dimensional surface will have to compromise something, the sizes and the proportions of the continent and so on. And of course, there's a very strong critique about the fact that the map privileges the north. It centers the map on Europe. That's absolutely fine. That's absolutely correct. And it also gives the impression that, for example, the southern parts of the world, such as Africa, are smaller than they are. Now, I think that's absolutely valid criticism, but at the same time, we can't lose from sight that the reason why the Mercator projection was developed in the first place was as a navigational tool, because you could draw straight lines on the map, and that would give bearing for navigators. So the Mercator map is basically a computational device. It basically saves the navigator to have to compute and process and do extra operations. And that's what, not all, but some maps are. They're cognitive devices that feed into wider activities. And in the military context, I think that is in fact a very crucial aspect. And that aspect, that function, that dimension gets lost, I think, in the critical approach, which, because it's so concerned with disputing the scientificity of the map, then loses sight of some of the instrumental, functional, pragmatic dimensions of the map. So that's what I was getting at there, and I think that's pretty indicative, perhaps, of the wider approach that I'm taking here, in the sense that I think what I'm interested in above all is the integration of all these dimensions. And what struck me early on is how interpenetrated all these dimensions are. You see these different developments happening in the fields of imaging, in the fields of mapping, in the fields of sensing, and there's a kind of logic and there are functional logics that hold these things together, that embed them together, and that see them instantiated in. And one way of doing that is looking at specific contraptions. So I started with that example of the camera obscura because I think it illustrates that very neatly. Because you've got here, a camera obscura, which is effectively a darkened room with a pinhole that allows light to come through and to be projected on a space, and you correlate that with a map, effectively drawn on a table, and so which is basically, so you've got a technique of imaging, of sensing, continuous surveillance of what's going on outside, a system of imaging, projection that leads onto a mapping surface that correlates perception with space, and a control interface, ultimately, that allows the targeting of force. So in the study that I'm conducting, there's other contraptions like that I look at to try and show how these things are all embedded in one another, and how historically there's a kind of push-pull. They further developments are brought about by the functional needs that these components serve, and that many of the technologies that we see more contemporarily, actually, the logics of it, the principles of them are very old. So there's aspects of computer vision which are really go all the way back to linear perspective, basically just exploiting these geometric relations that allows the correlation of vision with space. But it may take centuries sometimes to have the kind of mechanical means to do what was already incipient in those early manifestations. So I suppose that's perhaps so the phenomenology. I'm interested in how how humans are embedded in it, but I suppose what I'm even more interested in is the kind of necessities, the structural, functional links that connect all these different elements and that manifest themselves in particular contraptions.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. This excellent discussion. And does anyone have any final things they want to say or questions you want to raise? Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Antoine. And do you want to say anything? Any final remarks?
Well, just to say it was a pleasure, and thanks for your really acute questions, and I've enjoyed it a lot. So thank you for turning up and for putting it together, Jason.
Absolutely. All right, we'll see you guys next time.
Thank
All
you.
right, bye then.